I'm not going to tell you about Fort Knox. That's a show all by itself. Fort Knox is so historic. So I haven't included that in here. I'm not going to tell you about Camp Atterbury, but I am going to tell you about some things I bet you don't know about. And there was, as you might expect, World War II was perhaps the largest event in humankind history. It was arguably the largest event the United States has ever been in. The other one of merit was the Civil War. There was a smaller population in the Civil War, but the efforts were as huge as during World War II. So World War II was so enormous, and as you might then expect, training camps were everywhere. Training camps ruled and governed the day. We here in Evansville were really affected by Camp Breckinridge, George Army Airfield, which I was showing you, Sturgis Army Airfield. Did you know Evansville College trained pilots? That's a great story all by itself, and I'll show you a couple of pictures about that. And I will end up telling you, not about Fort Campbell, I'm not including. The problem with Fort Campbell and Camp Breckinridge are like one and the same. The streets were the same size, the barracks were the same size, everything was identical from Camp Campbell to Camp Breckinridge, so I've kind of thrown Camp Campbell out. But I do tell you about Fort Campbell and Clarksville base, which is on Camp Campbell, and I think you'll really be surprised when you hear about Clarksville base and what it was when many of you were younger. I'm going to begin with the Cyclone Division, and this was a real trick. These boys, let me start here. In 1970, the Indiana National Guard left Mount Vernon and went to Camp Shelby in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And here they are going by the courthouse in Mount Vernon. You see the cannons on the side here. This is where the old National Bank building is now. You know, recognize that? You know where you are? The statue is still there. The courthouse is still there. And when they got to Camp Shelby in 1917, they were putting up tents. This was then, and it was in World War II, a tent camp. And I figured out Hattiesburg was temperate. You know, it was not too cold, maybe never saw freezing temperatures there. So they put all of their boys in tents in 1917 and again during World War II. This was there in Mount Vernon, and in 1940 the National Guard left Mount Vernon again and went to Camp Shelby. And the deal was they were going down there for 12 months. This was January 1941. January 1941. Carl K. Connect made this cartoon, 1 year plus 18 months, the Senate, the House, and it was draftees and all of that. So it sounds like a great deal, huh? Are you ahead of me yet? This was January 1941. When they got there, this was some Evansville friends. This was Carl K. Connect, the Evansville Courier cartoonist, and this was Guthrie May. You recognize that name? Anybody know Guthrie May? North Park developer, all of those houses, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 houses he built out there. This is Captain Guthrie May, and Pat and I were not sure. This was another Evansville man. Up here's a guy with the 152nd Infantry sign, and this was they had just arrived at Camp Shelby at Hattiesburg. This was an Evansville boys band, and notice they're in a tent. Everything they did down there was in tents. And then Pearl Harbor happened. They had like a month to get out of Hattiesburg and go back home and be reservists. Well, Pearl Harbor happened, my goodness, think of that. These boys were really whacked in for the duration, huh? They were early participants in World War II, even though that wasn't part of the plan. And they kind of lingered around in the U.S. They were in Texas and in California, kind of home guard type assignments. But in January 1944, they made it to Hawaii. And I understand this is not great duty. I've heard guys tell me before Hawaii was boring. Once you had been there, and you know, if you weren't into sunbathing and all of that, it was pretty boring. There wasn't that much to go see in Hawaii. Now, they couldn't go out and see the volcano, or they couldn't do things like that. They had to make it on their own. So Hawaii, as you and I would have thought was not necessarily good duty. So these boys spent some time there, and then in July 1944 they went to the Philippines. And this is one of the most remarkable LST pictures of World War II. I count 20, and I've counted 20 several times, and I think that's what they had, and that was taking the troops in, and where the 38th Division, the boys from Evansville ended up, was liberating, I think liberating is a better word, Bataan. The Bataan Death March, and all of our prisoners, and they liberated those boys, and they came home then in September of 1945. Camp Breckinridge. Everybody know where Camp Breckinridge is? Everybody. It's about 20, 25 miles south of here, right before you get to Morganfield. And Camp Breckinridge, I knew it intimately. My grandfather was an early carpenter at Camp Breckinridge, and I'll show you his picture a couple of times, maybe 3 times in here. He was an early carpenter, and he spent the war years there. And I was, when World War II ended, I was 9 years old, but you know, I remember the good parts of the war. I didn't lose any people, any uncles to the war effort. So the World War II was kind to my family and kind to me, and I have fond memories, if I can say that. Granddad would always talk about there at Camp Breckinridge when the boys were shipping out. Camp Breckinridge was made for 45,000 trainees at any one time. And the boys would typically come in. There would be several divisions and regiments. You know, they were trained with cannon and medics and all of these things, but largely it was infantry divisions. And an infantry division would be 12 to 14,000 people. So you might have 3 of them working there, training at any one time. They'd spend about 2 months in there. Some were longer, I'm sure, some were shorter, but typically 2 months. And all of those boys would come to Evansville on Friday afternoon. They got liberty at like 2 o'clock. And back in those days, when a boy wanted to go somewhere, he just simply went out and put his thumb out. So help me God, the next car would pick him up. 40 or 50 guys could line up like that. And the cars would stop and take 1, take 2, take 3, and on and on and on. Pretty soon they'd work their way down. So the boys from these camps I'm talking about would hitchhike into Evansville. They would always go as best they could in good weather to the largest available town. The boys at Fort Knox would always go to Louisville. But I did marriage books of Davis County at Owensboro. And while I was doing that several years ago, I learned a lot of those Fort Knox boys married Owensboro girls, because it's in the marriage records and everything. So they didn't all go to Louisville. Some would go to some would come here to change your luck. Just think about that, you know, wanting to change their luck. See something new, meet someone different. But anyhow, that was Camp Breckinridge in Evansville. So they would come here, go back Sunday afternoon. This was a 1951 aerial view of Camp Breckinridge. It was big. 45,000 people. That's a heck of a town. Transient people, always. You see the helicopter landing pads. The 101st Airborne was in and out of Camp Breckinridge a couple of times. But they ended up at Camp Campbell, and I'll get into that a little later. This is my grandfather. This was my father, and that's me there in Morganfield. Granddad built that house out of scrap. When they were building the buildings, anything less than 2, maybe 3 feet would go to the scrap pad. So Granddad would go out in the evenings and forage and get am I in your way? I'm sorry. Remind me. I don't intend to do this. I know, but fuss at me. It's good nature. So the Granddad would go out and get the little wall stud pieces and make regular ceiling joists and wall studs out of that. This was my granddad, he told me right there. This man is my granddad, William Wells, and that's him right there. I'll show you another picture later on. I think he may be, and we'll go see about it. Oh, this was a field house. Camp Campbell had one just exactly like. It's total, it's complete, it's utter 100% wood. Camp Breckinridge had its own sawmills. They had timber, so instead of buying it, they actually set up sawmills and cut their timber. Camp Campbell did the same thing. So that's kind of the way they did it. Clever people back in those days. Here is Camp Breckinridge, chow time, 42-man barracks over here going into the mess hall. Camp Breckinridge had 186 mess halls, and this is the way they looked. They were all the same. Every mess hall had its own cooks, see the refrigerators, the cups. Look how neat it is. This is probably for the cannon. So you might guess about those potbelly stoves, 1, 2, and probably a third one at here. There was 10 non-denominational chapels. See, the Army was pretty smart. I'm sure the Navy wanted probably the same chapels for the Navies and Marine. You didn't design one for every camp. You designed one for every camp. And they were all identical. Some of the pictures you see, I don't show you one of the inside was kind of gaudy, and they were all gaudy. They all looked exactly the same. That's the way they were made. So here was 10 chapels at Camp Breckinridge. There was 468 barracks. 468. Imagine how much lumber, imagine how many carpenters it took to do that. My granddad, how he built that house, I don't know, because I'm sure they were working from sunup to sundown on building, sawing, and making these barracks buildings. 468. Remember, there's 45,000 people going to sleep down there every night. This was a Nazi village at Camp Breckinridge. You had to teach your troops to hate Hitler and the German soldiers. And this was not necessarily an easy thing. But they did try to see the soldiers coming out through the door, the hanging the guy, the swastika. Interesting thing, towards the end of the war, we were going for the invasion of Japan before the bombs were dropped. And they built an Oriental village because there was 30,000 Canadian troops were coming to Camp Breckinridge to train for the invasion of Japan. And I'll mention a little bit more about that later on, about how after Normandy, our world changed. The LST production, the P-47 production, the bullet production, the training camps, everything shifted at Normandy to Japan. Everything we did was thinking of the invasion of Japan, which was scheduled for November of 1945. So here was one case where the Canadian troops, they were on their way when we dropped the atomic bombs and the war was over. Canadian troops were coming to Morganfield and Camp Breckinridge. And they were building, I don't know, I never heard anything about the Oriental Village, but it was to train those Canadian troops how to hate the Japanese. You could kill a friend. You remember that. So, and that was a real problem Hitler had of trying to make his soldiers, his people, his population hate Americans. Man, we're filled up, you know. Lamasco is German. I worked International Steel out on north of here, and we had a special bay called Little Germany, and it was where the real talented ironworkers worked every day. Little Germany, you know, so it was kind of difficult for Hitler to make the Germans hate the Americans because they had relatives over here. And they kind of worked two ways and such. So anyhow, this was a Nazi village at Camp Breckinridge, and I'm sure everyone had one. Every training camp had a Nazi village or an Oriental village. This is about 8,000 troops. This is probably half of that division. I was telling you about 12,000 or so people. And they were on parade, and I will tell you that twice this many on a parade Friday afternoon were coming to Evansville. About 1/3 of those boys down at Camp Breckinridge were coming to Evansville on a nice weekend. Not a rainy one. I'll show you later what they did on a rainy weekend. So anyhow, those boys, think of that, twice that many, and they went to downtown. Pity those churches. The downtown churches in Evansville were simply phenomenal. What they did, you know, how they organized to sleep these boys. They would sleep, the first ones got the pews, the second one got the carpet, the later ones slept on the tile floor or the wood floors. And that was every Friday night, every Saturday night. Next weekend you do the same thing. So anyhow, these boys, twice as many would be coming to Evansville. Imagine the MPs. There was all manner of problem that you and I really can't picture. Because this was, I hope we never have to picture that. But World War II was just distinctly different from anything else the nation ever experienced, other than the Civil War. One thing I learned from studying the Civil War, those boys and those girls, The boys wanted the girls wanted the boys in the Civil War, just like in World War II. Times don't change. Human nature always rules and governs all of that. Here's a nice day weekend in Evansville. This is the hub right there, 5th and Main. That sign is still up there, by the way. Majestic Theater. Down at the end of here was the old Central Library. And these boys, this is the Salvation Army. They set up this truck on Friday afternoons, and they would take it down on Sunday afternoon. And the boys are getting their donuts and their tea. And I want to make one point here. This is off the subject, but notice this child. Here's her mother. Her mother is serving the soldiers, and this child is too. The child has gone to war, just like her mother, bless her heart. This is the way life went. All day, every day during World War II, here in New York City and Chicago, it was the same. I heard stories of Sturgis and of Morganfield. Anytime there was anything to go, basketball game, football game, baseball game, the crowd would be phenomenal there at Sturgis, which is what, 3 miles, 5 miles from Camp Breckinridge, and they would walk on into Morganfield and line the streets. There was hardly room to walk on the sidewalk. The boys just wanted to get, if they weren't coming to Evansville, they wanted to get a couple of beers and hobnob with their buds. So they would just line those sidewalks at Morganfield and Sturgis, one end to the other. And when it's time to go to bed, they make their way on back down to camp. So this is a nice day weekend when those boys were coming to Evansville. It was a rainy day weekend. Don't you love to see the mud and all of that? I see the whiskey bottles and I see the milk bottles. And you know, I wondered how that could be, and I asked a rhetorical question. Somebody said, they sell that in the base. They have the PXs that would sell the whiskey and the beer. So 1, 2, 3 guys maybe drinking out of the bottle, and the guy here with the milk, and their cigarettes, and you know, that's what they might do on a rainy day weekend instead of getting out and coming to Evansville or going to Henderson. My granddad may be in this picture. This was a prisoner of war guardhouse, and it was early 1943. People have asked me, and I wasn't prepared. They started bringing the German POWs in like in February of 1943. So I don't see, there's no leaves on the trees, so it's still winter, and these are carpenters, and Granddad was part of this. This is a fence right here for the POW, and there would be one of these at every corner of that fence. And I don't know if these men were armed. I'm sure they were. I don't know anything about it. There's no detail about the prisoners of war at Camp Breckinridge other than the pictures the murals that are painted there. There's not much information to gather about the POW camp. I have the drawings on it. And Life magazine did a 1943 special on Camp Breckinridge POWs, but I don't know details of it. Here they were in Sunset Park, May 1945. I see the Army Guard, and I think there's another one down here. So they're digging foxholes for show and tell. This was for the great Evansville Day Parade, which was in May of 1945. Evansville's largest crowd, 150,000 people came to that parade. I'm still angry at my parents because I didn't get to go see them. Mom and Dad were such darn patriots that they didn't want to waste the gas because we lived at the airport, so I never got to see the Evansville Day Parade. But it was big, and 150,000 people attended that. And as far as I know, that's the largest thing ever in Evansville. Was that? So here was Sunset Park, part of the display. There's a water plant in the background, and they're digging foxholes to show the public what that might look like. The 101st Airborne was in and out of Camp Breckinridge after World War II. This may have worked. There was 2 applications. Boys Town, which you've heard of, made application to come to Camp Breckinridge, but they weren't willing to give it up. They invited the Air Force Academy, and this is 1949-1950, to consider Camp Breckinridge, and they did. But the problem was it ran out of money. They didn't have the money to create the Air Force Academy, so they just put it on a shelf. And when they got it back out about 3 or 4 years later, Camp Breckinridge was not of any interest to them. So, you know, if they'd gone ahead with it, if they had the money for the first the first try. This could be the Air Force Academy down here at Camp Breckinridge site right now today. It's not. George Army Airfield in Lawrenceville, Vincennes, Illinois. I have a story to tell you about this, and I'll bring a tear to your eye. A good tear. Green River Road in Evansville was the first choice for this. Green River Road. Probably where Sam's Club is, where Lynch Road is. When the Army flew in, remember Pearl Harbor was early December, when the Army flew in to investigate the site in February of 1942, 3 months after Pearl Harbor, it was flooded. They'd had heavy rains in Evansville and it was flooded. And you and I know, if you've been around Green River Road, it does flood. So they fell back to their second one. The second choice was Mount Vernon. If you go from Evansville to Mount Vernon, when you get that stoplight before Mount Vernon, where the Mee Johnson and Bristol Myers were, to the south of there was 500 acres. That's what they were going to pick. But the problem with Mount Vernon was there was an oil boom going on and there was no housing. Well, they went to Lawrenceville, Illinois. They flooded out there in 1943, by the way. I hate to laugh, but I do. Should have gone to Mount Vernon, should have gone to Evansville. But Lawrenceville got it, and this is what they put up. Lawrenceville got this for $1. After $1. $1. Not two, $1. This is what they got, and it had 4 runways. This would have been, if it had been on Green River Road, think of that, Evansville International Airport. If it had gone to Mount Vernon, it would have been the Evansville Mount Vernon International Airport. But anyhow, they gave it to Lawrenceville, and they did have floods up here, bad floods in 1943, from which they never fully recovered. It was a bad flood. So that was the story. Right now, I think there's one runway. I think it's this one right here is still operational. It's called a Mid-America Airport at Lawrenceville, Illinois. Here, yeah, Mid-America Airport. Here was let me tell you the story. Pilots were always trained in the southern states, south of the Ohio River, if you would, south of Kentucky. And somebody in Pentagon or Washington had a clever idea. Hey guys, it does rain and snow in Germany and Japan. Let's train pilots where it rains and snows. Clever, huh? So they did that. This was the northernmost pilot training field. I don't know if there's any now that are north of here or not. But the pilots, there was a snow day. You know, they had to learn to fly in snow. Not a bad plan, huh? These were AT-10 Wichitas. These were all wood aircraft. And they had 250 some odd airplanes up here on the field. You could see where they were all lined up, and they're probably out flying. They flew around the clock. You know, the pilots had to train around the clock. So that's what these guys would be doing around the clock. I love this picture, Revelry, at George Field, before we had electric. And this is a George Field photograph, an actual one. So, but isn't that neat? You know, that's a real keeper's picture right there. This was a link trainer at George Field, where the pilot would get in here and they'd pull it. You know, they still use these. They're not called link trainers, but these were big in World War II and after World War II, right? Still got these going? You ever been in one? Oh yeah. Have you? Where they close the hood and the pilot sits in there, and it's training pilot or practicing pilot sits in there and learns how to do his thing. See the woman out here with her telephone talking to his earphones? This was the last graduation class. Remember I talked about Normandy? See the date, August 1944, the last class. Normandy had taken place, and the nation began to change. We had enough pilots, this was multi-engine. If you notice, these are multi-engine airplanes. The pilots had trained on single engine and learned to fly those and had their certificates, so they came up here to learn to fly multi-engine, which would put them into B-24s, B-17, or any multi-engine airplane, whether it's bombers or cargo, DC-3s, what have you. So notice this is wood. Any carpenters in here? Look at the roof structure on this thing. There was 3 big hangars up there during the years that they were up there, and this is all wood. You know, America's war effort was all wood, saved on steel. saved on aluminum, things like that. So here was the last class. See all the troops? See them? And their friends and family up there to see that. So after that, and I don't use pictures of it, they changed from multi-engine to glider pilots, where they trained, and those were sergeants. And they trained, I don't know how many glider pilots for two reasons. One, of course, was for Europe, largely for Japan. We were going to send, heaven knows, 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 gliders into Japan. Among all of those, you know, there was 1 million men going, American soldiers were going into Japan. It was so large you can't conceive of it. And we were training these, and I'll show you another episode in just a little bit of Sturgis. So anyhow, these were after the multi-engine pilots that got into glider pilots. The airborne, this is a good story. There's very little remaining evidence. The Evansville Courier and the Evansville Press just mentioned the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment one time. Now these are the boys that became the 101st Airborne later on. And I'll tell you another one that's really interesting in a moment. But these boys, here's Republic Aviation, Highway 41, got the picture. Old Highway 57, McCutcheonsville. Here was the airport. Here's where I lived, right here. Right up here in McCutcheonsville is where Swope's Grocery was, S-W-O-P-E-S, right there at the big triangle where the roads come together in McCutcheonsville. All right, here's what I've learned. They wrote of this PIR, 502nd PIR, Parachute Infantry Regiment, camped out on the airport right over on this corner. The command post was up here in McCutcheonsville, and Swope's Grocery was a PX. People would go in and to look at, I'm serious, people would go and look at the Baby Ruths, the cigarettes, the Lucky Strikes, to look at the little Debbie cakes, whatever they had in those days. Because you couldn't buy those, but they had them up there in Swope's Grocery because it was a PX for the paratroopers. They could go in and get their Coke. They could go in and get a jug of milk. They could go get a Baby Ruth candy bar and Chesterfield cigarettes. You know, they should have. And we gave them the best without any anger or begrudgment whatsoever. I never heard a word before, during, or after World War II about, you guys get everything. Well, they got the steak and the bacon and the butter. That's fine. They're going off to die. So we love that part. They arrived on Memorial Day in '43, left Evansville about 6 weeks later, sailed to England in September. D-Day invasion was June the 6th, so you can see right there from Memorial Day to, that's what, 13 months from the time they were here till they go in, dropped into Normandy on D-Day. Here was the Swope's Grocery. Swope's Grocery, see the paratroopers out here? Whenever in Evansville, the boys, at least, I'm sorry, right up here, adopted a dog. And they named it Thunderbolt after the airplanes. Now let me tell you a little bit more about this. I can tell you they were definitely there because the Evansville paper reported that. Here's Sunset Gardens right here. Those guys out there say they can find evidence that there was campers, paratroopers on this ground right here sometime during the war. I have had people, here's Petersburg Road going up towards Stringtown Road, that there was paratroopers camped out here. I really believe, and I'll never be able to prove it, that there were paratroopers on this corner, this corner, this corner, and this corner during these months, right, Memorial Day through July in 1943. They had one racial episode downtown. And this was a heck of a story. The people at Camp Breckinridge, people at Atterbury, the people at Fort Knox, were coming to Evansville. There was going to be an unarmed war in Evansville, and they made Evansville off limits. So there was no soldiers coming to Evansville the following weekend, and all the MPs from all the area came to Evansville to make sure there was no soldiers and there was no combat given in Evansville that following weekend. And it died. That was the end of boom. That was it. The words were that the lieutenant, they had a push and shove fight down on the other side of Main Street, And one thing led to another, and word got out that that lieutenant had been killed. And that's why everybody, all the soldiers in the area got all upset and everything. He wasn't. He showed up Monday. This happened Friday night. He showed up Monday in his dress uniform up at Swope's Grocery and let everybody see him. I'm not dead, I'm alive. And that pretty much ended it right there. But it was a heck of a story of what could have been in Evansville over that episode. So were there a full regiment all camped out around the airport? I believe so, but I can't prove it. I just know there was a company right here. We'll come back to that in a minute. This may or may not have been Thunderbolt. This is 101st. This is before it was 101st, and that's, you know, dog in charge. Paratroopers loved their dogs. They would take them, and they to be a paratrooper dog, the dog had to be thrown out or jump out of the airplane 5 times. They also like boats. I kid you not. Paratroopers, you know, life was pretty boring, and otherwise unless you were fighting and doing all this training thing. So they used anything to break the monotony. Dogs and goats. That was a real deal. That's no cats as far as I found out. But anyhow, you know, this guy's in charge of that whole blame thing, if you ask me. Sturgis Army Airfield. We have Sturgis people here. Rich sent me some information from, you flew in down there, did you not? And took some pictures. I didn't use any of those, but I do want to show you that here was a 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment at Sturgis. So you had a 502 at Evansville, and I don't want you to get confused. Do you know who the 506 was? Have you seen the HBO movie series Band of Brothers? That's who that was down there. These were the boys. And they were what? Dick Winters and Gannier. If you remember, you've seen it. You remember Bill Gannier and Bob Toy, famous paratroopers that HBO made famous, and in Stephen Ambrose's book. They were walking on the streets of Sturgis. Hey, they probably came to Evansville as well. I like that. You know, these guys were genuine heroes for real. And then, of course, the HBO miniseries and the book that Stephen Ambrose wrote made them pretty famous people. So they were down there at Sturgis. Now, I just discovered that last night when I was rereading the papers you sent me. I look up 506, and I did, and sure enough, Stephen Ambrose wrote about these guys. So thanks to Rich, I learned that. This was Tuskegee Airmen. They were assigned at I used to go to Madisonville and Henderson to read the newspapers down in that part of Sturgis and Camp Breckinridge, and all of a sudden, and January, Sturgis went secret. Tell me if I'm wrong. I think it was January 1943. Nothing. There was Sturgis went secret for some reason. It was a commander, I'm sure. So we don't know anything about what they were doing. But this was Tuskegee Airmen Squadron that was at Sturgis for a while. And notice a dog. B-25 probably couldn't get its wheels down, so I crash landed and slid in. And these were Tuskegee Airmen working on the engines on B-25s. And all of these guys went to something called the Tennessee Army Maneuvers. This was the largest thing in America. Did you know that? This was Central Tennessee. And over about a year and a half, there was 850,000 soldiers either moved into Tennessee in trucks, or all of the paratroopers dropped in once, twice, 3 times. The reason they used Tennessee because that land was set up for Normandy. The land was very much like what these boys would be seeing when they went inland from the Normandy beaches. They would be seeing ground like what they would see down there in central Tennessee, north of, I don't think Nashville was included, but all of that east and west and north of there was. 22 counties. That's a pretty good sized area. So you can imagine there's some great stories. Those soldiers were warned, you eat out of your pack. You don't eat anything else. Well, they told about one group that's told a story about their platoon kicked in $1 each, and that for $21 they got the Feast of Kings that night. So, you know, they could get a meal for 20, 25 cents. And they kicked in $1 each, and they just ate like princes that night. So I'm sure that happened a lot down there. The family that cooked for them was happy. They had $21, and the boys had all they wanted to eat and such. So this was the Tennessee War Games, as it was called. Fort Campbell, I'm going to show you. Fort Campbell became, April 1950, it became Fort Campbell. A camp like Camp Breckinridge and Camp Campbell was temporary. A fort was when it was made permanent. Fort Knox was permanent, my goodness, since before the Depression. So you know Fort Campbell now, and I will only show you this picture of it. Did you know about this? The shuttle almost landed down there 5 or 6 years ago. The first choice for the space shuttle landing was, of course, Kennedy. They're at the Space Center. Second was Edwards Air Force Base in California in the deserts. Third was Camp Campbell, Fort Campbell. I get that right, because it's such a lot, 3 miles long, for Pete's sake. You know, it's a great, big, long, luxurious runway, and they stopped in to thank them. The problem was that Kennedy and Edwards were both having weather problems, flood maybe, and weather and rain, and the shuttle had to land the next day, and it was coming to Fort Campbell, and I was going. I was going to park on I-24 down there and watch that thing go ahead, but they canceled it. It went ahead and landed at Kennedy, so that was the end of that. So as a thank you, they brought this into to Fort Campbell. I want to take you to Evansville College to the pilot's training. This was the V5 Navy Cadet Pilot Training Barracks. And where this is, Audubon Park entrance is down here. Okay, can you get that? Right up here you have the first stoplight in Henderson is right here at Watson Lane. And this was the Audubon CCC Camp Barracks. The interesting thing about this was that there was no housing available. Evansville College wanted to do this Navy pilot training program, and they've trained 254 pilots here at Evansville College. But they didn't have any place to put them, so Indiana, the state of Indiana, rented these cabins from the state of Kentucky. And I think it was a couple $100 a month to rent those. Isn't that cool? You know, when you got to get things done, and it's wartime, you get things done. So Indiana paid Kentucky for the rent of these cabins. Notice the airplane. Here's Highway 41, just like it is today. It was only 2 lanes. Now there's another lane. I don't know which side it's on over here. Here's the Ohio River. You can see the Ohio River in the background. Watson Lane and Audubon Park entrance is over here, where those CC Camp boys worked to build Audubon. So that's what you had. The great part of this was they had 17 trainers, and the city bought the ground where Sam's Club is now, and it was named Memorial Field. And that's where the boys would go to fly. You had half the boys every morning would go out to fly those airplanes. The other half would go to the college for ground school. And they would eat lunch, I don't know where, and then they would swap them. Well, the neat part was they would take these airplanes in every afternoon to the regular Evansville Airport, store them there where there was security. They didn't have any fences or lights or anything out there where Sam's Club was. So they would house these at the Evansville Airport. And those boys that would go out to fly in the mornings, that half would go out and board in. 17 of those guys would get on the airplanes and fly them out there to where Sam's Club is. And at noon they'd meet to eat, and then they'd swap everything. And the boys that flew in the afternoons would fly them back to the Evansville Airport. Neat, huh? That's how it worked out. And they had several classes that went through the Navy Cadet program. Pretty soon, it got where the Navy said, we don't need any more. Just like the Army said, we don't need any multi-engine Air Force pilots, airplane pilots. The Navy said, we have enough pilots to take care of the invasion of Japan. See how things changed? So kind of around Normandy was when they shut this program down. Does anybody know what these airplanes are? I simply can't identify what these are. If I go back to this one, I can't make anything out of that than I can with these. I don't know if they're World War I airplanes or probably after World War I. Maybe they were trainer planes, maybe they were for some other use. I want to go now to Fort Campbell, Camp Campbell. And this was a Clarksville-based nuclear storage facility. Nowadays, they're able to tell what went on. And you can actually tour this thing. I got a tour of it about 5 years ago. And this was a book, it's Adventures of an H-Bomb Mechanic who was based at Fort Campbell, and he was a bomb engineer, he was a bomb mechanic. And this is his story of what he did. And I can't get into it like I want to, but I'm going to show you some of the things about that, which I thought were pretty interesting. That's a real patch of Clarksville base. They had 1,000 Marine Guards, 1,000 of them at Clarksville base, 1,000 Marine Guards. Here was a big problem. This was an Army base with 1,000 Marine Guards. That didn't work very well. The Army was angry about it, the Marines were angry about it. To make matters worse, back in the days we're talking about, the airplanes, the B-36s, the B-47s that flew with the hydrogen bombs, they had a bomb that wouldn't go off. They flew around with it, and the bombs were large as these tables. One bomb was this big, maybe 12 or 20 tons, enormous. For a long time, when there was a threat, those airplanes would fly into Fort Campbell, that big 3-mile-long runway, and these guys would go out and arm that bomb with a hydrogen bomb pit that they had been working on. I'll show you the tunnels. And here was the rub. When they went from where the Clarksville base was to the airport, which was a mile or two, the Army guys had to turn with their backs to the streets, stand at attention while those Navy Cubes took those bombs out to arm those airplanes. Can you imagine how angry that would make you if you were 100? That was your life. You lived there at Fort Campbell, and you had to turn your back and watch those Navy pukes. You know, they call them a lot worse than that. But all of those guys were sworn for 40 years of silence. I knew, man, he would never tell me. I'm talking about before I knew what this was about. I knew he worked at the birdcage, which was at Camp Campbell. And I had heard these stories. Now, I used to live in Paducah and in Eddyville and Catawba. And I would hear these stories from the people that worked there and had served there in the military after the war. And I could never put it together until I got to all of this. Everybody was sworn for 40 years secrecy. They had all of these guys out in the taverns around Clarksville. Clarksville base, I guess, was named that because it was close to Clarksville, Tennessee. But these guys would haunt those taverns and make up a chum. You have a cigarette, they would buy you a drink. What do you do for a living? Where do you work? What do you do there, huh? And if the guy said anything, he's gone the next day. Dead serious. I mean, this was our livelihood. This was America's greatest secrets right here we're talking about. So 40 years came and passed, and those guys still won't talk. So when the major took me through, the curator of the museum there at Fort Campbell took me back in there, and he said those guys that worked at Clarksville base still won't talk. Well, the 40 years are gone. It's about 5 or 6 years ago, so now they can talk. Maybe they'll free up and tell. The military has gotten much more free. I think you can go down there and schedule and get the tour of what I'm going to show you. Here is Clarksville base. It was called the birdcage for one of two reasons, and I'll tell you both the reasons. Here was Highway 41 goes right through here. Clarksville is on down here a couple, 3 miles. But Highway 41 is very close to that edge right there. I'm going to show you a cemetery. My last picture will be the cemetery, which is up in here, but I'll show that to you. I'll show you a picture of the gravel Gertie. You remember what gravel Gertie was in Dick Tracy? Wasn't it gravel Gertie? That's where they got this name. I'll show that to you. Here was, and this is current. This is a picture I took of the fence. Look over here, there's one fence, see the fence post there, 2 fences, 3 fences, 4 fences. This was a lethal fence, this was an electric fence. and 3 people did die on that fence during Clarksville base. One guy committed suicide. One guy knew it was there, but he didn't realize, you know, this was dark. When something disturbed, these lights would kick on at night, and the Marine Guards were always touring around through here. They could go to where the lights were on and see what, you know, that was security. The lights would go on. And they knew they had a problem. And I'm sure there was alarms went off in the Marine Guards' house and everything to tell them. There was 2 bridges. This was West Fork Creek. How do you secure a creek? They did it twice. See up on the bridge, and this bridge I went across here, that's a guardhouse that was up there. And what they had were steel gates that they constantly raised or lowered to whatever level the water was. And if the, you know, generally in summer it was okay, but when the water got to coming up, they'd have to go out and raise this gate, that gate, you know, all down through here, and at both ends of the base and everything. So that was the work of 1,000 Marine Guards had to do all of this. These were, here's a machine gun emplacement at grade, here's a machine gun emplacement, and Marines manned that 2 men would be in here probably all day and maybe all night. This is not a good duty. This is a trick house. This is all concrete. That you enter through here and you went downstairs, that's 17 foot of concrete. See the windows? All trick. They did this across the nation. It was more than just Clarksville base. To camouflage it from whom? I don't know. I guess the Russians that was stake in here and take a look. It's open now, but when I was down there 5 years ago, it was a little bit more secure. I'll tell you about that in a moment. These were gravel girders. Here's me. There's a gravel girdie. Here's another picture of it. Now this is not Clarksville base. This is Pantex, Texas. And what these are, they're made to withstand the explosion of a 1,000-pound dynamite explosion. So the men would work down in here. When back in the olden days, they had to change out a part of the bomb mechanism every 138 days because it would go bad, and you take that bomb pit in, as it was called, replace that part, and then it could be put back in an airplane, the bomb on the airplane. So every 138 days, every bomb got refreshed, renewed, and rebuilt. So that's what they would do in here. And if that dynamite for some reason exploded, it of course would vaporize, kill the guy, but it would blow these things up, and they wouldn't vent, it would just go up and drop down. And then you had a lifetime to recover. The person, and nobody ever died from this as far as I know, but that's why a gravel girdie was. It was simply to contain the explosion, the radiation and all of that. By the way, read what I have. Roswell Area 51 aliens are buried right here. That's worldwide, you know, that's famous legend of where those Roswell, New Mexico, Area 51, you've all heard of that little area a lot. And this is where the aliens are buried, is right here. Goes the publicist. Who's to know? Yeah, who's to know? I kind of doubt it, but anyhow, I thought you'd like this story that I'm showing you. I went back in, and there was, if I go back here, see these long black things? Those are tunnels. I'm not sure what these are. They're also called storage things, but I went back in one of these, number 7740. And back in there, you walk 2 football fields to get back in there. And it's pitch black. This is all just camera. Everything. It was pitch black. And we didn't have any flashlights. The major and several of us went back in there and everything. And well, he had a flashlight. He had a flashlight. I had a camera. So I would light up everything when I took those pictures. But this is what they had back in those doors, 7 of them. This is where they stored those bomb pit parts, P-I-T. Now this was also called a bird cage. And the interesting thing about this guy, and they're still using these, you put your pit down in here, the plutonium thing, and these are, you know, if you get plutonium, when you squeeze it together, it makes a detonation. As long as it's not compressed as critical stage, can you understand what I'm saying? It won't detonate. So you can stack them all up together, and these things keep it where it's not, never gets critical. Can you understand? This is called a bird cage as well. So whether Clarksville base, the bird cage is called that because of the 4 fences or because of these, I don't know. Here's a picture of plutonium metal, and I like this one. This is a plutonium pit. Those pits are this size, 4 1/4 inches, roughly 4 1/4 inches diameter. So this would actually be that size. Sometimes I drop the ball. I'm not going to do it to you. I did that one time. I checked. Everybody kind of jumped on. I shouldn't ought to do that again. So it's good to drop the ball. It's nicer to think of it rather than do it. And here's what you get through all of this at Clarksville base. Now I told you that that was from 1947 to 1962. After World War II was over, at Camp Breckinridge, and specifically I know about Camp Campbell, those POWs stayed in place. If they were to send them back home to Germany, what they going to do? The women, I'm serious, the women were taking care of rebuilding Germany. They didn't have enough food as it was. If you sent all of these hundreds of thousands of POWs back into Germany, they could work, but you had to feed them. And there was a problem. There was no food. There was not enough food for Germany or, all of the Axis powers, Japan. Everybody struggled for several years. In fact, I've read that Germany was not made whole again until 1980. Back about the time Ronald Reagan became president, think of that. They were still trying to rebuild, and they had the Berlin Wall, all that stuff, the Berlin area to fight. So the inmates at Camp Campbell, as it was in there, they stayed here. The inmates at Camp Breckinridge stayed here. It was a kind of a humane thing. And we shipped them all back. We didn't necessarily want to keep them. They could stay. And this is the burial ground. This is my closing picture at Camp Fort Knox. There were 5 German POWs who were killed, I guess, in making those tunnels. That's what they did. They made these atomic tunnels and those buildings, so 5 of them died. And this is pretty neat. Notice there are 5 stones, fenced in, American flag, German flag. And this is the 5 German POWs that died, and they're honored very well with flowers, or whatever those are called. I have one question now, I'm serious. You can fly the American flag out of doors at night and put light on it, right? You guys know what that is? So what do? Is this flag, I can't see any lights here. I don't know, I suspect they have a daily routine where they take the flags in and the next morning they go and put those flags back up. Fort Campbell does that, I guess, every day. Because I don't see any lights, and I'm sure that if we took we're going to do the flag our way. I don't know about the German flag, but I'm sure they honor it the same as ours. That's the last show I have. I was going to show you some more shows on Sturgis Army Airfield as we go through. Do you have any questions? Let's take care of any questions you may have first. Sir?
How long did the German POWs capture?
It appears they left in about 1947. That was what they thought. There's no records of that. Did you know? There's no record. Camp Breckinridge has no records of who, what, when, and where. Isn't that remarkable? But, we had so much going on in World War II recovery, and maybe there just wasn't the end. And remember, Camp Breckinridge was having 101st, and this group, and that group, and this group, and that group. So there was no real administration from day to every day at Camp Breckinridge, and I'm sure Camp Campbell was going through much of the same thing at the time.